Welcome back to another episode of Flawless Plan Garage, where today we are once again attempting to cram a 6.6 liter Duramax diesel turbo diesel V8 and Allison transmission into my 1994 Buick Roadmaster station wagon. And today we're going to focus especially on the steering. As you've seen in the last few videos, I have converted the chassis of the Roadmaster to use a C5 Corvette front cradle and front suspension and front steering system now. But of course, can't be that easy. I do not have room to run the steering rack in the normal location and actually get the engine, because they need to occupy the same space at the same time, and that laws of physics, blah, blah, that just doesn't work. So we're going to attempt to come up with a solution of some kind to that today. But first, I need to tell you about today's sponsor. Today's video is brought to you by the number 3, because that's how many steering racks I've bought so far. Stay tuned. Yeah, roll the ugliness. Okay, new flawless plan on the steering that I want to experiment with. So I think that I still have some ground clearance to play with here. And what I want to try is maybe a lower position for the subframe, but pretty much keeping the engine here, because the engine at this height, I think, will fit. The question is, can we lower the subframe to give a little bit more room for the steering rack and still have ground clearance, or is that really going to also hose up like the position of the suspension? As a reminder, at the current height, the steering rack actually goes, like 2 inches above that mounting bracket, which means even if I could, flatten out and reduce the height of the oil pan up front here, there's still nowhere near enough room to get the steering rack in that space. But if I had another inch and a half to play with, maybe, when the steering rack was lower, I could flatten out, make a custom section of the oil pan up front. Maybe there'd be room for the rack up underneath there. I wanted to try an inch and a half because I happen to have some, pretty convenient inch and a half spacers available to me, so I didn't have to move any of the tack welds. I just spaced the subframe down temporarily. And it was pretty easy that way to space the engine up an inch and a half. The good news here is that for the first time in forever, I finally have room for a steering rack. I need about 2 1/4 inches, ignoring the fittings on the hydraulic lines, but I need about 2 1/4 inches above the top of those ears, and it looks like I have it, assuming that there's nothing, that the crank doesn't drop down into this plane, and that I could make the oil pan flat here in the front, which I think, we'll see. We'll have to take a look at that. But this would give me the closest I've had so far to having room for the steering rack in roughly the stock location. Okay, oil pan is off. That was a lot of work. And yeah, it's pretty much the worst case scenario. Remember how I needed to be able to get the front of the motor? Yeah, there's something in the oil pan that's very much in my way. Looks like the oil pump drops down a solid 2 inches below the block, maybe a little more. So the very, very best I could do when it comes to modifying the front of the oil pan would be to just, cut it to here, to where the bottom of the oil pump is. How much would that even represent as far as a cut? Let's see here. Here's the oil pan. It's about 4 inches deep. So I could cut about half of it. I'm really wondering if I can potentially move this forward. Now, the question is how much and to where? It seems to me that there's a little bit of space to work with where it could move, an inch or two forward and have room to clear the cradle, or maybe have some minor clearancing modifications done to the cradle itself. Or I think failing that, it would have to move much more significantly out to here, which is normally where the anti-sway bar goes. So I don't know how feasible that is and how crazy it's going to get to have to make some new kind of sway bar or do something else to combat sway. However, the real question, what is the actual impact going to be on the important steering angles if I was to move this steering rack forward on the suspension? Now I know when it comes to bump steer is primarily going to be affected by the height of this attachment, and this attachment over here, and then the ride height, and the angles that are relative to this, lower control arm and upper control arm, and kind of the plane of the ball joint again here. I think in any case, if I'm moving it fore or aft, if I keep it at the same height, I think the changes to bump steer should be minimal. So I'm not too concerned about bump steer right this minute, but I am a little concerned about Ackerman. So let's take a look at what that would mean. Okay, time for some CAD, cardboard aided design, which is useful not only when making brackets, but also when evaluating potential suspension geometry. So what we're going to take a look at here is the Ackerman as represented by both the stock suspension and the potentially modified suspension. This is representing the stock steering rack location and the stock tie rods with the wheels here. Here we got the front wheels and the chassis rear axle back here. So Ackerman essentially describes the ability to turn the inside wheel. So here the car is turning to the right, and the inside wheel actually turns more at a steeper angle than the outside wheel does, which is what you want, because in effect, or in reality, that inside wheel is actually turning in a smaller circle than the outside wheel is because of the width of the car. So this is a good thing. You want some Ackerman that turns that inside wheel more than the outside wheel. And you can see my rough approximation here of the stock Corvette front steering geometry, even with a front steer set up with the steering rack, does have some Ackerman built in. The pivot points, or where the tie rods attach on the suspension, are a little bit outside of the ball joints, hopefully in a way that roughly approximates what you would have if you drew a straight line from the rear axle all the way through the ball joint. Ideally, you want the tie rod to mount up on that same plane if you were to draw that imaginary line. Now, I'm sure the Corvette engineers intended that for a much shorter wheelbase than what I've got now, but nevertheless, it's obvious that there is some stock Ackerman built into the Corvette front suspension, and that is a good thing. However, my concern right now is that I may not have room for the steering rack to be in that stock location. And here is what it would look like were I to move the steering rack forward and use longer tie rods on that stock steering rack. You can see now the Ackerman is still pretty screwed up. You can see hopefully visually here, but I measured it loosely as well with like a protractor. And once again, we are actually getting more turn-in angle on the outside wheel than we are on the inside wheel. Maybe a little bit more obvious there. Undesirable. So the question when it's all said and done is this: what am I going to do? Am I going to move the rack, deal with Ackerman problems, or come up with some other flawless plan to improve this? I have no idea. I think I'm going to need more tea and more cardboard and some time to think. So I'm going to attempt is shoving the steering rack straight down. As far as steering geometry is concerned, that should be solvable, because what that'll create, if the whole rack is mounted lower, it'll create bump steer, because this arm will not be in the right plane with the lower control arm anymore. But that should be solvable with a spacer. should be able to space this tie rod down the same amount that I dropped the rack, and that should hopefully deal with the bump steer issue. The question is, can I shove this rack down and come up with some new way to mount it far enough to get us what we need clearance-wise? I don't know, and I'm a little reluctant to cut up this beautiful and expensive Corvette subframe, but I think that's what we're going to do next. I think we're going to start chopping up the subframe in the hopes that I can just shove the rack straight down. It will obviously have some effect on the strength of the subframe, but also remember that I'm boxing it in with these big, fancy, expensive cast aluminum adapters up here. Time for irreversible decisions. Cutting on expensive aluminum parts that I can't weld back together. Review cutting tools so far. Dremel, 3 to 5 seconds of cutting before either breaking the disc off or wearing it out. Die grinder, nearly infinite with this little grinding stone because it clogs up with the aluminum and doesn't really do anything. Vibrating flush cutter thingy, I don't even really know what to call this, with a special metal cutting blade that was advertised 30 times longer life. The regular ones must be pretty short because I think I got 15 seconds or so of cutting out of it, and a quarter of the teeth are broken off now, and some of the ones are clogged with the aluminum. So yeah, not great there. Plasma cutter. Not working nearly as well as I would like. I think maybe the aluminum is dirty, which is struggling, and also I've got a vertical piece underneath here that the plasma can't cut straight down through. Yeah, it's been a struggle so far. Next, Sawzall. Yeah, we're pretty close. So here's what it looks like with the oil pan cut and just a little bit of clearance above the steering rack. I don't know how I'm going to deal with the fittings. You can see one there, it'll be clear, but there's another one like right in the middle of the oil pan. So that remains to be seen, how to deal with that. But the rack itself in this position appears to fit. The engine is roughly level in both directions, sitting right here, propped up by some carefully calibrated pieces of wood. It's very, very close, and it appears that we do have the possibility of a steering system. All right, I think we're going to wrap this video here for today. No, it's not just the glasses. I don't just look older. I am, in fact, older. In fact, I'm 9 months older than I was at the beginning of this video. And when it takes the full gestation period of a human being to make a video about trying to get a steering rack to fit, I think it's time to wrap it here. In summary, we were not able to move the subframe lower and space it down. That caused all kinds of suspension problems and ground clearance problems. We were also not able to move the steering rack forward, or certainly backward, because of oil pan issues going back and Ackerman issues going forward. However, I think we've been able to cram the steering rack down into the subframe. There are still issues to deal with before we're going to be able to say that this car can actually steer itself. We've got a steering shaft, we've got to actually affix the steering rack to the subframe somehow. We've got to deal with those hydraulic lines somehow. I don't know, there's work left to do, but to find out how all that comes out, you and I are both going to have to wait, and we'll both be a little bit older before we do. But thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. If you're enjoying this at all, you know how to support YouTube videos that you like, so thanks. I appreciate it. We'll see you next time.